November 12, 1988, and New York General Hospital occupied an entire city block in Manhattan's Upper West Side, a sprawling 12-story medical complex where hundreds of staff members worked around the clock caring for patients. The hospital was a maze of corridors and departments, with emergency rooms on the ground floor, patient wards on floors 2 through 8, operating rooms and ICU on 9 and 10, and administrative offices on the top floors. Lauren Mitchell was 17 years old that Saturday night, a high school senior with long dark hair usually tied in a ponytail, brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and a serious demeanor that made her seem older than her years. She wore the standard volunteer uniform, light blue scrubs with a white volunteer badge clipped to the pocket, comfortable sneakers for walking miles of hospital corridors, and her student ID from Roosevelt High School on a lanyard around her neck. Lauren had been volunteering at New York General for 8 months as part of her school's community service requirement, and she'd become passionate about medicine, planning to apply to pre-med programs the following year. She typically worked weekday afternoons helping with patient transport and delivering flowers, but she'd volunteered for an extra overnight shift on November 12th because the hospital was short-staffed due to several volunteers being sick. The night shift ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and Lauren's duties included restocking supply closets on the patient floors, delivering late-night meal trays, and assisting nurses with non-medical tasks like changing linens. Lauren's supervisor was Nancy Chen, a volunteer coordinator who worked the overnight shift twice weekly, and Nancy had paired Lauren with another volunteer named Jessica Torres for the evening. At 11:15 p.m., Nancy assigned Lauren to restock supply closets on the 7th floor, while Jessica worked on the 5th floor, and both girls were given walkie-talkies to stay in communication with Nancy at the volunteer station. Lauren took the elevator to the 7th floor, which housed the medical surgical unit with 40 patient rooms arranged along 2 long hallways that formed an L shape, and several nurses' stations positioned at intervals. At 11:30 p.m., Lauren radioed Nancy to confirm she'd arrived on the 7th floor and was beginning her rounds, and Nancy acknowledged the check-in, noting the time in her log as was standard protocol. The 7th floor was relatively quiet that night with most patients sleeping, and 2 nurses were on duty at the main station, while another made medication rounds through the patient rooms. Lauren was seen by nurse Amanda Rodriguez at approximately 11:45 p.m., entering the supply closet near room 712, with a cart loaded with linens and medical supplies, and Amanda remembered Lauren seemed perfectly normal and focused on her work. At midnight, Nancy radioed all volunteers for a routine check-in, and Jessica responded immediately from the 5th floor. But Lauren didn't respond despite Nancy calling her name 3 times over the walkie-talkie. Nancy assumed Lauren's radio had died or she'd accidentally turned it off, and she called the nurses' station on the 7th floor asking them to tell Lauren to check in when they saw her. Nurse Amanda Rodriguez went to the supply closet where she'd last seen Lauren at 11:45 p.m., but the closet was empty with the supply cart sitting half-filled in the middle of the room, and Lauren was nowhere to be seen. Amanda checked nearby patient rooms and the break room, thinking Lauren might have gone to help a patient or take a quick break, but after 10 minutes of searching, she radioed Nancy that Lauren appeared to be missing from the floor. By 12:20 a.m., Nancy had contacted hospital security and a search was initiated for the missing volunteer, with guards checking all floors and staff members asking if anyone had seen a teenage girl in volunteer scrubs. In approximately 35 minutes, while working alone on a hospital floor with nurses nearby and security cameras in hallways, 17-year-old Lauren Mitchell vanished from New York General Hospital without explanation. If you're already invested in this mystery, hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and comment where you're watching from or what you think happened. Now let's see how the search unfolded. Security guard Martin Hayes reviewed camera footage from the 7th floor and confirmed that Lauren had exited the elevator at 11:32 p.m. and walked toward the supply closet carrying her walkie-talkie. But despite cameras positioned at both ends of the corridor and near the elevator banks, there was no footage showing Lauren leaving the 7th floor at any point after she'd arrived. Hospital security began a systematic floor-by-floor search, checking patient rooms with permission, searching bathrooms and storage areas, and questioning staff members about whether they'd seen the missing volunteer. Lauren's parents were contacted at 12:45 a.m., and her mother Patricia arrived at the hospital within 30 minutes, frantic with worry because Lauren had never shown any sign of being irresponsible or wandering off. She called me at 10:30 to say she was heading to the hospital for her shift, Patricia told security. She was excited about the overnight work. She thought it would give her good experience. There's no way she'd just leave. The NYPD was notified at 1:15 a.m. when it became clear Lauren wasn't anywhere in the hospital, and detectives arrived to interview staff and review security footage that seemed to show an impossible disappearance. Lauren had entered the 7th floor through the only elevator that serviced that area, and cameras showed nobody else had entered or exited that floor between 11:30 p.m. and midnight when her absence was discovered. The supply closet where Amanda had last seen Lauren was processed as a potential crime scene, with investigators checking for signs of struggle or blood evidence, but they found nothing unusual beyond standard hospital supplies. By 2 a.m., over 50 NYPD officers were searching New York General Hospital, going room by room through every floor, including areas typically off-limits to volunteers, looking for any sign of the missing teenager. Detective Robert Santos led the investigation and immediately focused on the security camera blind spots, because Lauren had to have left the 7th floor somehow, and if cameras didn't capture it, she must have used a route without coverage. The hospital had cameras in main corridors and near elevators, but budget constraints meant not every hallway and doorway was monitored, and there were several stairwells and service corridors that had no camera coverage whatsoever. Detective Santos interviewed nurse Amanda Rodriguez extensively about the last time she'd seen Lauren, and Amanda insisted the girl had seemed completely normal, focused on restocking supplies, showing no signs of distress or fear. She was humming to herself while she worked, Amanda recalled. She seemed happy, content, just doing her job like any other night. There was nothing that suggested anything was wrong or that she was planning to leave. The walkie-talkie Lauren had been carrying was found in the supply closet sitting on a shelf next to boxes of gauze, and the fact that she'd left it behind suggested either she'd stepped away briefly intending to return, or someone had made her leave without it. Hospital maintenance workers were interviewed about access to restricted areas, and they explained that the 7th floor had several locked doors leading to mechanical rooms and storage areas that required keycard access limited to specific staff. None of these restricted areas had been accessed between 11:30 p.m. and midnight, according to electronic keycard logs, which should have meant Lauren couldn't have entered them, but every room was searched anyway. Detective Santos requested complete employee records for everyone who'd been working at New York General that night, and background checks were run on doctors, nurses, support staff, security guards, and maintenance workers. The theory that Lauren had been taken by someone emerged quickly because the alternative, that she'd voluntarily left her shift without telling anyone, seemed completely out of character based on her history and reputation. Lauren's parents insisted their daughter was responsible and dedicated, never missed commitments, and had been passionate about her volunteer work, with dreams of becoming a doctor that she talked about constantly. Her friends from Roosevelt High School were interviewed, and all described Lauren as serious, studious, and focused on her future, with no boyfriend, no drug use, and no indication she was struggling with anything that might make her want to disappear. The hospital's emergency room entrance was checked to see if Lauren had left through that route, but security footage showed she never appeared in any area near the exits on the ground floor. Investigators theorized that someone might have convinced Lauren to enter a patient room or staff area under false pretenses, and then harmed her and hidden her body somewhere in the vast hospital complex. But searching a 12-story building with thousands of rooms, closets, storage areas, and mechanical spaces would take days, and time was critical if Lauren was injured or in danger somewhere in the building. By 4 a.m., cadaver dogs were brought in to search areas where a body might be hidden, and the dogs showed interest in several locations, but ultimately found nothing that led to Lauren. The supply cart Lauren had been filling was examined forensically, and investigators found her fingerprints on boxes and supplies, confirming she'd been working normally before disappearing. But there were no other prints or evidence of anyone else being in the closet with her. Detective Santos interviewed Nancy Chen extensively about volunteer protocols, and whether Lauren had mentioned anything unusual or expressed concerns about staff members or patients during previous shifts. Lauren never mentioned being uncomfortable around anyone, Nancy explained. She was professional and got along well with staff, and if she'd had any concerns she would have told me because we had that kind of relationship. Jessica Torres, the other volunteer working that night, was interviewed about whether Lauren had mentioned plans to go anywhere or meet anyone during the shift, but Jessica said they'd barely spoken before being assigned to different floors. The The seventh-floor nurses were questioned about whether any patients had been particularly difficult or concerning that night, and whether anyone had asked about the volunteers or shown unusual interest in Lauren. All patients on the floor that night were elderly or recovering from surgery, and none seemed capable of overpowering a healthy 17-year-old, or had histories suggesting they'd harm someone. Hospital security guard personnel records were reviewed, and one guard named Derek Walsh raised flags because he'd been working in the building that night and had a prior arrest for assault from 1982, though charges had been dropped. Walsh was interviewed extensively, and his movements tracked through keycard access records, showing he'd been on the ground floor and basement levels during the time Lauren disappeared, nowhere near the 7th floor. By dawn on November 13th, the intensive search had produced no evidence of Lauren's whereabouts, and investigators were forced to expand their focus beyond the hospital to surrounding streets and neighborhoods. The theory emerged that Lauren might have left the hospital voluntarily, through a route investigators hadn't identified, perhaps meeting someone outside or responding to some emergency. But this seemed unlikely, given her abandoned walkie-talkie and unfinished work. Security footage from the hospital's exterior was reviewed, showing everyone who'd entered or exited the building between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m., but Lauren never appeared in any of the footage from multiple camera angles. Patricia Mitchell appeared on local news broadcasts pleading for information about her daughter, and Lauren's photo was shown across New York media outlets, a serious-looking girl in her volunteer scrubs who'd simply vanished. By Monday morning, the story of the missing volunteer had captured New York's attention, with newspapers running headlines about the teenager who'd vanished from a hospital, while cameras recorded empty hallways where she should have appeared. FBI agents joined the investigation due to the possibility of kidnapping, and they brought resources including behavioral analysts who created a profile of anyone who might target a teenage volunteer in a hospital setting. The profile suggested someone with intimate knowledge of the hospital's layout and camera blind spots, possibly a staff member who'd been watching Lauren during previous shifts and waiting for an opportunity when she was alone. Every male employee who'd been working at New York General on November 12th was interviewed again with increased scrutiny, asking about their movements and requiring them to account for their time during the critical 35-minute window. One doctor named Richard Brennan became a person of interest because a nurse reported he'd made uncomfortable comments about Lauren during a previous shift, calling her pretty and asking her age in a way that felt inappropriate. Brennan was interviewed extensively and his background investigated thoroughly, but he'd been in surgery during the time Lauren disappeared, with multiple witnesses confirming his presence in the operating room on the 10th floor. Detective Santos focused investigation on the stairwells that connected floors but had no camera coverage, theorizing that Lauren might have used stairs to leave the 7th floor and encountered someone in the stairwell. Hospital staff confirmed that volunteers were allowed to use stairwells, and the doors weren't locked from inside, though they required keycards to enter from the stairwell side on most floors for security purposes. If someone had grabbed Lauren in a stairwell and forced her to another floor or out of the building, it would explain why cameras never captured her leaving, but extensive searches of all stairwells had found nothing. The basement levels of the hospital were searched repeatedly because they contained maintenance areas, morgue facilities, and tunnels connecting to other buildings, spaces where someone could potentially hide a person or dispose of evidence. Cadaver dogs were brought through the basement and sub-basement areas multiple times, and while they showed interest in certain locations, investigations revealed the alerts were related to morgue areas where bodies were legitimately stored. By December, the case had generated hundreds of tips from people claiming to have seen Lauren at various locations around New York, but every sighting was investigated and found to be either mistaken identity or fabrication. A homeless man reported seeing a girl matching Lauren's description getting into a car near the hospital around midnight, but he couldn't provide details about the vehicle or driver, and investigators found no evidence supporting his account. The theory that Lauren had been suffering from some mental health crisis and had left the hospital in a dissociative state was explored, but her parents, friends, and teachers all insisted she'd shown no signs of psychological distress. Lauren's bedroom was searched for diaries or notes that might indicate she'd been planning to run away or meeting someone secretly, but investigators found only schoolwork, medical textbooks, and college applications to pre-med programs. Her phone records showed normal teenage communications with friends about homework and weekend plans, with no suspicious calls or contacts with unknown numbers that might suggest she'd been communicating with someone her family didn't know about. Detective Santos became convinced that Lauren had been taken by someone within the hospital, someone who knew her schedule and had planned the abduction, but without physical evidence or witnesses, he couldn't identify who. The FBI behavioral analysts suggested the perpetrator might have been someone in a position of authority who could have convinced Lauren to go somewhere under the pretense of hospital business, making her feel safe until it was too late. This theory led to renewed focus on doctors and senior staff members who would have had credibility with a teenage volunteer, but background checks and alibi verification eliminated suspects without producing a viable person of interest. By early 1989, the intensive search had been scaled back, and the case was transferred to NYPD's cold case unit, where it would be periodically reviewed, but no longer had dedicated detectives working it full time. New York General Hospital implemented security improvements including additional cameras in stairwells and corridors, mandatory buddy systems for overnight volunteers, and stricter access controls for restricted areas. But these changes couldn't bring back Lauren or explain how she'd vanished from a floor with nurses nearby and cameras in hallways, leaving behind only her walkie-talkie and a half-filled supply cart. Patricia Mitchell quit her job as a paralegal and dedicated herself to searching for Lauren, distributing missing person flyers across New York and coordinating with other families of missing teenagers. She appeared regularly on local news programs keeping Lauren's case in the public eye, and she organized searches of parks and abandoned buildings where she feared her daughter might have been taken. The case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries in 1990, and the broadcast generated renewed tips. But as with previous leads, investigation revealed nothing that brought investigators closer to understanding what had happened to Lauren. Some investigators theorized that Lauren had witnessed something criminal in the hospital, perhaps drug theft or abuse of patients, and had been eliminated by people who couldn't risk her reporting what she'd seen. But there was no evidence of any criminal activity at New York General during that time period, and Lauren had never mentioned seeing anything concerning to her supervisor or parents. The supply closet where Lauren was last seen became known among hospital staff as unlucky or haunted, and some volunteers refused to work on the 7th floor, though management dismissed these concerns as superstition. The years passed slowly for the Mitchell family, with 1988 becoming 1995 and then 2005, and Lauren's bedroom remained exactly as she'd left it the night she'd gone to her volunteer shift at New York General. Patricia never stopped searching, spending thousands of dollars on private investigators and psychics and anyone who claimed they might be able to help locate her daughter or provide answers about what had happened. Age progression photos were created showing what Lauren might look like at 25, then 35, then 45, and these images were distributed through missing persons databases and featured on websites dedicated to unsolved disappearances. Lauren's father Thomas had died in 2002 from a heart attack that doctors attributed to years of stress and grief, and he died without ever knowing what happened to his daughter or where she'd gone that November night. Detective Santos retired from NYPD in 2008, but kept copies of Lauren's case file, and he continued investigating on his own time, convinced that someone who'd worked at the hospital knew more than they'd shared. He tracked down former hospital employees who'd been working the night Lauren disappeared, interviewing them decades later to see if time had made them willing to share information they'd withheld. Most had vague memories of the incident and insisted they'd told everything they knew to investigators in 1988. Though several mentioned the case had haunted them because it made no logical sense. One former security guard named Marcus Webb contacted Santos in 2010 with information he claimed he'd been afraid to share in 1988, and his account added a disturbing dimension to the case. Marcus said he'd seen someone in scrubs carrying what looked like bundled linens through a basement corridor around 12:30 a.m., and the person had been moving quickly toward the loading dock area where delivery trucks access the hospital. "I didn't think much of it because staff moved supplies around all night," Marcus explained. "But now that I think about it, the person seemed nervous and didn't make eye contact when I asked if they needed help." Marcus couldn't provide a detailed description because the corridor had been dimly lit, and he'd only seen the person briefly from a distance, but he remembered they'd been wearing surgical scrubs, not volunteer uniforms. Santos investigated this lead extensively, but 22 years had passed and verifying Marcus's account was impossible, and some questioned whether his memory had been influenced by years of media coverage about Lauren's disappearance. The theory that Lauren had been sedated or incapacitated and carried out through the loading dock area gained traction, but without physical evidence or identification of the person Marcus claimed to have seen, it remained speculation. By 2015, Lauren would have been 44 years old, possibly with a career as a doctor if she'd survived and completed her dreams, though the statistical likelihood seemed impossible after 27 years. True crime podcasts began featuring Lauren's case in the 2010s, analyzing the hospital layout and security systems, and proposing theories about what might have happened in those 35 minutes. Some podcasters suggested Lauren had been taken by a serial predator who worked in hospitals, someone who'd developed a pattern of targeting young women in medical settings where they'd appear trustworthy. Investigators looked for connections to other missing persons cases involving hospitals or medical facilities, and they found several women who'd vanished from hospitals in the 1980s and 1990s under mysterious circumstances. But attempts to link these cases to a single perpetrator found no concrete evidence connecting them beyond the general similarity of the locations, and no suspect emerged who had connections to multiple hospitals. The most persistent theory remained that Lauren had been abducted by someone who worked at New York General, someone who'd planned the crime carefully and had knowledge of camera blind spots and building layout. But identifying who among hundreds of employees might have been responsible proved impossible without physical evidence, witnesses, or a confession that never came, despite decades of investigation. Detective James Morrison was assigned to review the case in 2018 as part of NYPD's Cold Case Initiative, and he spent months examining evidence with modern forensic techniques and databases that hadn't existed in 1988. Morrison used advanced mapping software to identify every possible route Lauren could have taken from the 7th floor supply closet, including service corridors and areas that might not have been thoroughly searched initially. He discovered that a service elevator used primarily for laundry and supply transport had been operational that night and wasn't covered by security cameras, and it connected the 7th floor to the basement loading area. This service elevator would have allowed someone to move Lauren from the 7th floor to the basement without appearing on any security footage, and it connected directly to the loading dock where Marcus Webb had seen the person carrying bundled linens. Morrison's theory was that someone had entered the supply closet, subdued Lauren quietly, wrapped her in linens to transport her, and used the service elevator to take her to the basement where she was taken out through the loading dock. But this theory, while plausible, couldn't be proven without identifying who had done this or finding evidence that Lauren had been in that elevator or basement area, and both had been thoroughly cleaned countless times since 1988. Patricia Mitchell, now in her 70s and suffering from health problems related to decades of stress, continued to search for her daughter through online databases and missing persons organizations. She'd never remarried after Thomas died, dedicating her life to finding Lauren and helping other families of missing persons navigate the nightmare of not knowing what happened to their loved ones. The website Patricia maintained about Lauren's case received thousands of visits annually, and she responded personally to every message from people offering theories or claiming to have information about the disappearance. By 2024, Lauren Mitchell's disappearance has become one of New York's most haunting unsolved cases, studied by criminal justice students and discussed in forums dedicated to people who vanish from places they should have been safe. The image of Lauren in her volunteer scrubs, smiling in her ID photo, has been shared millions of times across social media by people fascinated by how a teenager could disappear from a hospital with nurses nearby and cameras in hallways. Patricia Mitchell, now 76 and living in a nursing home, keeps age progression photos beside her bed, showing what Lauren might look like at 53, faces created by computers showing a middle-aged woman who exists only in algorithms. "I still expect her to walk through my door," Patricia told a reporter in 2023. "Every time someone knocks, I think maybe this time it's Lauren coming home. And then I remember 36 years have passed and she's probably been gone the whole time." The NYPD maintains Lauren's case in their cold case database, and her information is cross-referenced whenever unidentified remains are discovered or when similar disappearances occur in medical facilities anywhere in the country. Detective Morrison retired in 2023 but continues to review the case periodically, and he's interviewed dozens of forensic experts and hospital security specialists trying to understand how someone could vanish so completely from a monitored building. "Hospitals are actually easier crime scenes than people realize," Morrison explains. "Multiple exits, staff coming and going all night, areas where cameras don't reach, and legitimate reasons for people to be moving patients or equipment around. The theory that Lauren was taken out through the loading dock wrapped in linens remains the most plausible explanation, But without identifying who did this or finding physical evidence, it exists only as an educated guess based on logistics. New York General Hospital underwent major renovations in 2015, and during demolition, workers searched every wall cavity and hidden space hoping to find remains or evidence related to Lauren, but nothing was discovered. The hospital had changed ownership twice since 1988 and had been partially rebuilt, but the 7th floor where Lauren disappeared retained some of its original layout, and some staff members report uncomfortable feelings in that area. Former employees occasionally post online about their memories of the night Lauren vanished, and several admit they've felt guilt for decades about not noticing something that might have helped or paying closer attention. "We were all just doing our jobs," one former nurse wrote. "None of us realized a girl was being taken right under our noses. And I think about that constantly, how someone evil was operating in plain sight and we missed it." The volunteer program at New York General was suspended for 2 years after Lauren's disappearance, and significantly restructured when it resumed, with mandatory buddy systems and tracking technology that didn't exist in 1988. Patricia has stated she wants to be buried beside her husband Thomas when she dies, and she's arranged for Lauren's name to be included on the headstone, even without a body, acknowledging her daughter is likely gone. The walkie-talkie Lauren left in the supply closet has been preserved as evidence, sitting in an NYPD evidence room for 36 years, a silent witness to the moment when a teenage volunteer set it down and never picked it up again. True crime communities continue to debate Lauren's case online, proposing elaborate theories about hospital conspiracies and serial predators, but internet speculation cannot create evidence that doesn't exist, or answer questions that have persisted for decades. Some amateur investigators believe Lauren witnessed something criminal, perhaps illegal organ harvesting or medication theft, and was killed to silence her. But no evidence of such activities at the hospital has ever been found. Others think she was targeted by someone who'd been watching her during previous volunteer shifts, someone who developed an obsession and waited for the right moment when she was alone and vulnerable. The most statistically likely explanation remains abduction by someone with hospital access, who used the service elevator and loading dock to remove Lauren from the building, but identifying who did this has proven impossible. The case stands as a reminder that even in buildings full of people and security systems, predators can operate successfully if they understand the environment and exploit its weaknesses at the right moment. And it highlights how quickly someone can vanish when the perpetrator has knowledge, planning, and opportunity aligning in those brief minutes when nobody is watching carefully enough. Detective Morrison believes someone who worked at New York General that night knows something they've never shared, either because they were involved or because they saw something suspicious they dismissed at the time. "Hundreds of people were in that building," Morrison says. "Someone saw something, someone knows something, and I hope they come forward before it's too late, before everyone who might have answers is gone." But as of today, the New York hospital corridors keep their secrets, and Lauren's fate remains one of the city's most baffling unsolved mysteries, a case that challenges understanding of how completely people can vanish. The last confirmed sighting of Lauren Mitchell shows her on security footage at 11:32 p.m. on November 12, 1988, exiting an elevator on the 7th floor carrying a walkie-talkie, appearing focused and purposeful with no indication that in minutes she would disappear forever. And somewhere in New York, or in a place no searcher has yet looked, or in memories someone has kept hidden for 36 years, the answer to what happened to Lauren Mitchell that night may still exist. But until that answer emerges, if it ever does, Lauren remains among the missing. Her disappearance an enduring mystery that reminds us how vulnerable young people can be and how evil can hide in the most trusted institutions. The memorial page dedicated to Lauren shows her smiling in her volunteer uniform, proud to be helping at the hospital, frozen forever in that moment before she walked onto the 7th floor and into a mystery that has never been solved. And every November 12th, Patricia Mitchell lights a candle in her nursing home room, looking at Lauren's photo and talking to her daughter as if her voice might somehow reach across the decades and the unknown. "I never stopped looking for you," Patricia whispers to the photo. "I never gave up hope even when everyone else said you were gone, and I'll love you until my last breath even though I don't know where you are." But the hospital hallways offer no answers. The security footage shows only empty corridors, and the mystery of what happened to Lauren Mitchell during a volunteer shift in 1988 remains unsolved to this day. The supply closet on the 7th floor where Lauren was last seen has been renovated and repurposed multiple times. But the mystery of what happened there endures as one of New York's most haunting unanswered questions. And in evidence rooms and case files and the hearts of people who knew her, Lauren Mitchell exists as both a person who lived and loved and dreamed of becoming a doctor, and as a symbol of how completely someone can vanish, leaving only questions behind.